Welcome to Dusk and Empires. Tonight, we journey into the shifting sands of Arabia with a mysterious British officer who united warring tribes and helped topple an empire. The legend of Lawrence of Arabia begins with a quiet scholar who became one of history's most enigmatic figures. If this sounds like your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let history carry you to sleep. Close your eyes now, and let your breath settle into the rhythm of the desert wind. Feel your body sinking deeper into comfort, as if settling onto warm sand beneath a canopy of infinite stars. Tonight, we journey to a time when the world was reshaping itself, when ancient empires crumbled and new nations struggled to be born from their dust. Picture the Arabian Peninsula in the early 20th century, a vast expanse of golden sand and black stone, where Bedouin tribes have wandered for millennia, following paths known only to the stars and the whispered wisdom of their ancestors. Here, beneath skies so clear they seem like dark water, time moves differently. A day's journey might cover 30 miles, or 300, depending on the will of the desert and the mercy of hidden wells. Into this timeless landscape came a young man from Wales, pale and scholarly, carrying books and languages the desert had never heard. His name was Thomas Edward Lawrence, though he would become known by many others, Orans among the Arabs, Lawrence of Arabia to the world, and to himself, perhaps, a stranger whose reflection grew more foreign with each passing year. This is not the story Hollywood told, of daring charges and romantic heroism. This is the quieter, deeper tale of a man caught between worlds, speaking languages of scholarship and warfare, of Western civilization and Bedouin honor, of truth and the legends that devour the truth-tellers. Let the day's concerns drift away like smoke from a dying fire. We have time here, in this place between sleeping and waking, to discover the man behind the myth, to walk beside him through Oxford halls and desert wadis, through the corridors of power and the loneliness of command. Rest your body deeper into stillness, and let your mind wander with us into the shimmering heat of history, where nothing is quite what it seems, and legends are born from the marriage of truth and necessity. In the gentle hills of Wales, where mist clings to ancient stone and rivers run clear over beds of slate, Thomas Edward Lawrence was born on August 16, 1888. The house where he first drew breath sat quietly in the village of Tremadoc, its windows looking out over landscapes that seemed designed for contemplation, rolling green expanses broken by dry stone walls built by hands long since turned to dust. But this peaceful beginning carried a secret that would shape young Lawrence in ways both subtle and profound. His father, Thomas Chapman, had left his wife and family in Ireland to live with Sarah Junior, a governess who would become Thomas Edward's mother. They never married, though they took the surname Lawrence and moved through a series of quiet towns, always respectable, always slightly apart from the communities they briefly called home. The boy who would become Lawrence of Arabia grew up knowing, without it ever being directly spoken, that his family existed in the margins of Victorian respectability. This knowledge settled into him like sediment in still water, not troubling the surface, but changing the fundamental nature of what lay beneath. He learned early to navigate the space between truth and appearance, to understand that identity could be constructed, that names and histories could be worn like clothing, chosen for purpose rather than inherited by accident of birth. In 1896, when Thomas Edward was 8 years old, the Lawrence family settled in Oxford, in a house on Polstead Road that would become the stable centre of his formative years. Oxford in those days was a city where medieval spires cast shadows over gaslit streets, where ancient Latin minglings with the clatter of bicycle wheels and the distant whistle of steam trains. It was a place suspended between centuries, much like the boy who would soon walk its cobbled lanes with books tucked under his arm and dreams of distant places filling his mind. The house on Polstead Road was modest but comfortable, with a garden where Sarah Lawrence grew roses and vegetables with equal care. Inside, the rooms were filled with books, not just English literature and history, but works in French and Latin, Greek classics and contemporary archaeological texts. Thomas Chapman, despite the irregularity of his domestic arrangements, believed deeply in education, and he filled his son's world with languages and learning, with maps of distant places and stories of civilizations that had risen and fallen while England was still a collection of Celtic tribes. Young Thomas Edward proved an unusual child, even in a household that prized unusual learning. While his brothers played typical boyhood games, he developed obsessions that would last lifelong, with medieval history, with military fortifications, with the careful craftsmanship of weapons and armor. He would spend hours in his room, drawing detailed plans of castle walls, calculating angles of defense, imagining himself walking the battlements of Crusader strongholds that had stood empty for centuries. His mother, Sarah, watched this intense, pale boy with mixture of pride and concern. He read voraciously, but always alone. He excelled at his studies, but seemed to exist at a remove from his classmates, as if he were observing them through glass. When other children were learning to navigate the social waters of childhood friendship, Thomas Edward was teaching himself to read medieval Latin, working through chronicles of battles fought in places whose names sounded like poetry. At Oxford High School, his teachers quickly recognized both his brilliance and his strangeness. He could discourse knowledgeably on the architectural evolution of Norman keeps, but seemed genuinely puzzled by the ordinary concerns of adolescence. His essays on historical subjects read like the work of a scholar twice his age, filled with insights that suggested not just learning but genuine understanding of how power operated across centuries and cultures. It was during these school years that Lawrence first encountered the work of Charles Doughty, whose Travels in Arabia Deserta would become one of the formative books of his life. Doughty's massive, strange, beautiful work, part travel narrative, part anthropological study, part prose poem, opened Lawrence's imagination to the Arabian Peninsula in ways that would prove prophetic. He read of Bedouin hospitality and cruelty, of the terrible beauty of landscapes where survival depended on intimate knowledge of wind patterns and the location of hidden water sources. More than the adventure of it, Lawrence was drawn to Doughty's attempts to understand the Arabian tribes from within, to see the world through eyes shaped by different assumptions about honor, loyalty, and the relationship between individual and community. Doughty had traveled among the Bedouins not as a conqueror or missionary, but as a student, learning their language and customs, sleeping in their tents and sharing their bread and salt. In 1896, when Lawrence was 18, he made a decision that surprised his family and teachers. He chose to read history at Jesus College, Oxford, rather than pursuing mathematics or classics, subjects where his abilities seemed more obviously suited to academic success. But Lawrence had already begun to understand something about himself that would define his entire life. He was drawn not to abstract knowledge, but to knowledge that had been lived, that had shaped human choices in moments of crisis. Jesus College in those days occupied ancient buildings that seemed to grow from Oxford stones like some natural formation. The quad where Lawrence walked to his tutorials had been paced by scholars for centuries, and the library where he spent his days contained manuscripts that connected him directly to medieval minds grappling with questions of loyalty, faith, and the proper ordering of human communities. His tutors quickly recognized that they were dealing with an exceptional student, but one whose interests ran in channels they found difficult to predict or direct. Lawrence's essays were brilliant but idiosyncratic, filled with insights drawn from sources his professors had never considered relevant to their subjects. He wrote about medieval military architecture with the eye of someone who had studied actual siege warfare, about the economics of feudalism with understanding that seemed to come from somewhere beyond mere book learning. But it was outside the formal curriculum that Lawrence's real education was taking place. He began to spend long hours in the Bodleian Library, working through texts in Arabic and Persian, teaching himself languages that would later become the tools of his transformation. He read not just about the Crusades from European perspectives, but sought out Arab chroniclers, trying to understand how the same events looked from the receiving end of Western military expansion. This was revolutionary thinking for a young Englishman in Edwardian Oxford, where the empire's civilizing mission was taken as axiomatic, where the study of history too often meant the study of European triumph over less technologically advanced peoples. Lawrence was developing a historical imagination that could hold multiple perspectives simultaneously, that could see conquest from both sides of the sword blade. This intellectual flexibility, this ability to shift between worldviews, would later make him invaluable as a liaison between British and Arab interests and would ultimately tear him apart. In the summer of 1909, Lawrence embarked on a journey that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of his life, though neither he nor anyone else could have predicted it at the time. He had decided to write his undergraduate thesis on Crusader castles, and rather than relying solely on documentary sources, he determined to visit and study the fortifications themselves, scattered across what was then Syria and Palestine, territories of the crumbling Ottoman Empire. This was an extraordinary undertaking for a 21-year-old Oxford undergraduate. The journey would require traveling alone through regions where European visitors were rare, where local politics were complex and potentially dangerous, where simple survival might depend on understanding customs and courtesies developed over centuries of tribal interaction. But Lawrence had been preparing for exactly this kind of challenge, though he might not have articulated it in those terms. He spent months learning Arabic with the help of a Syrian Protestant minister living in Oxford, though his ear for languages and his obsession with precision meant that his Arabic would eventually develop far beyond what those initial lessons provided. He studied maps and travel accounts, corresponded with archaeologists and travelers who had visited the regions he intended to explore. Most importantly, he began to cultivate the mental flexibility that would become his trademark, the ability to see himself not as a British tourist visiting quaint foreign territories, but as a student seeking to understand how different peoples had solved the universal human problems of survival, governance, and meaning. The Lawrence who set out for Syria in June 1909 was still recognizably the pale, intense Oxford undergraduate, traveling with letters of introduction and a budget carefully calculated to last 3 months. But the young man who would return to England that autumn had undergone a transformation so complete that his friends and family would struggle to recognize him. His first stop was Damascus, that ancient city whose very name carries the weight of centuries, where the straight street mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles still runs through bazaars that have been trading in silk and spices since before England was Christian. Lawrence found lodging in the Christian quarter, but spent his days wandering through the Muslim sections of the city, observing how space was organized, how privacy and community were balanced, how the rhythms of daily life accommodated both practical necessities and religious obligations. From Damascus, he traveled north to Aleppo, then began the systematic survey of Crusader fortifications that was the ostensible purpose of his journey. But at each castle, Sion, Margate, Croix de Chevaliers, he found himself increasingly interested not just in the military architecture, but in how these foreign strongholds had been integrated into the local landscape, how they had been supplied and defended, how they had fallen. At Croix de Chevaliers, that massive fortress that still dominates the Syrian countryside like some impossible dream of stone and mortar, Lawrence spent days measuring walls and sketching architectural details. But he also sat in the great hall where Crusader knights had once planned campaigns, trying to imagine what it had felt like to be so far from home, surrounded by landscape and peoples whose every assumption about proper living differed from their own. More significantly, he began to seek out local people who could tell him stories about these places, not just their current use, but memories passed down through generations about how they had functioned, how they had been perceived by the Arab and Kurdish populations who had lived in their shadows. This was unusual behavior for a European visitor. Most Western travelers of that era collected architectural measurements and photographic records, but treated local populations as part of the scenery rather than as sources of historical knowledge. Lawrence's approach was different because his imagination was different. He was beginning to understand that these castles were not isolated monuments to European military might, but nodes in complex networks of political, economic, and cultural exchange that had shaped the region for centuries. A fortress was not just a collection of walls and towers, but a statement about how power operated, about the relationship between rulers and subjects, about the delicate negotiations that made life possible in contested territories. It was during this journey that Lawrence first encountered the Bedouin tribes whose lives would later become so intimately connected with his own. Traveling between castles often meant crossing territory where Ottoman authority was theoretical at best, where real power resided with tribal leaders who controlled access to water sources and safe passage through traditional routes. His first meeting with Bedouins came near Urfa, when the small caravan he had joined was approached by horsemen whose intentions were initially unclear. Lawrence watched as his traveling companions went through elaborate rituals of identification and negotiation, observed how strangers established their bona fides through complex webs of tribal connection and personal guarantee. When it became clear that the European traveler was under the protection of respected local guides, the Bedouin leader extended the traditional hospitality that governed such encounters. That night, sitting around a fire of camel dung and thorny shrubs, Lawrence experienced something that would haunt him for the rest of his life, a glimpse of social organization that seemed to operate on principles entirely different from those he had known. The Bedouin camp was not egalitarian in any Western sense, hierarchy and status were clearly defined and carefully observed. But they seemed to operate according to logics of kinship, honor, and reciprocal obligation that created different kinds of relationships between individuals and community. Lawrence's Arabic was still primitive, but he could follow enough of the conversation to understand that these men were discussing politics and personalities with sophistication that surprised him. They were not the noble savages of Orientalist fantasy, nor were they the backwards tribesmen of colonial stereotype. They were people managing complex lives in difficult circumstances, using tools of social organization that had been refined over centuries of adaptation to particular landscapes and historical pressures. When he returned to Oxford that autumn, Lawrence found himself struggling to write his thesis on Crusader military architecture. The subject that had once seemed so clear and contained now appeared impossibly complex, embedded in webs of cultural interaction that his original research framework had not been designed to capture. His professors, reading his draft chapters, found themselves confronted with work that was technically excellent but somehow displaced from the topic they thought they had assigned. Lawrence had set out to study European fortifications in the Middle East, but had returned with questions about the nature of political authority, the relationship between military power and cultural influence, the ways in which attempts at domination inevitably became forms of cultural exchange. These were not the questions that Oxford history was equipped to answer in 1910, but they were the questions that would define Lawrence's life. It was during this period of academic frustration that Lawrence received an invitation that would prove more decisive than any thesis he might have written. D.G. Hogarth, the keeper of the Ashmolean Museum and one of Oxford's most distinguished archaeologists, had been following Lawrence's Syrian journey with interest. Hogarth was preparing to launch a major archaeological expedition to Carchemish, an ancient Hittite city on the Euphrates, and he needed assistants who combined scholarly training with the practical ability to work effectively in Ottoman territory. Lawrence's Syrian experience, his developing command of Arabic, and his demonstrated ability to navigate complex cross-cultural situations made him an obvious candidate. But more than that, Hogarth recognized in the young man something that would make him invaluable in the field: an intellectual curiosity that extended beyond narrow academic specialization, a capacity for seeing familiar things from unfamiliar angles, an instinctive understanding that the past could only be recovered by engaging seriously with the present. The ancient city of Carchemish sits on the western bank of the Euphrates River, where the borders of modern Turkey and Syria converge in landscape that seems designed to humble human ambition. When Lawrence first arrived there in the spring of 1911, what remained of the great Hittite capital was mostly invisible, buried under centuries of accumulated earth, and the small Kurdish village of Jarablus, whose inhabitants had built their modest homes directly over ruins that contained the debris of empires. The British Museum expedition to Carchemish was directed by Sir Leonard Woolley, a methodical archaeologist whose approach to excavation emphasized careful documentation and systematic exploration. But the actual work of uncovering the ancient city required managing a complex labor force drawn from local villages, negotiating with Ottoman officials whose authority over the region was often more theoretical than practical, and maintaining diplomatic relationships with tribal leaders whose cooperation was essential for the expedition's safety and success. Lawrence arrived at Carchemish as a junior member of the team, nominally responsible for photography and the cataloging of pottery fragments. But Woolley quickly recognized that his young assistant possessed unusual talents for the kind of cultural navigation that made such expeditions possible. Where other Europeans maintained careful distance from their local workers, Lawrence began almost immediately to involve himself in the daily life of the village that surrounded the excavation site. This was not simply a matter of learning Arabic more fluently, though Lawrence's command of the language was advancing rapidly through constant use. He was developing something rarer and more valuable: an intuitive understanding of how social relationships operated in this particular place, how decisions were made, how conflicts were resolved, how information traveled through the informal networks that actually governed daily life. The house where the British archaeologists lived stood slightly apart from the village proper, built in the European style with separate rooms for sleeping, eating, and working. Lawrence found these physical arrangements artificially isolating. He began spending more and more time in the village itself, taking his meals with local families, participating in the elaborate social courtesies that structured community life, learning not just the language but the cultural grammar that made communication possible. His particular friend was Dahom, a young Arab who worked on the excavation and whose intelligence and curiosity matched Lawrence's own. Dahom became Lawrence's teacher in ways that extended far beyond language instruction. Through their friendship, Lawrence gained access to perspectives on history, politics, and social organization that no European education could have provided. Dahom helped Lawrence understand that the Hittite ruins they were excavating represented just one layer in a palimpsest of occupation that stretched back millennia. The Kurdish villagers who lived over the ancient stones carried folk memories of Byzantine churches and Arab armies, of Mongol invasions and Ottoman administration. Their present was not separate from the archaeological past the British expedition had come to study, but was part of a continuous history of human adaptation to this particular landscape. Through Dahomey, Lawrence also began to understand the political currents that were reshaping the Ottoman Empire in ways that would soon affect every village along the Euphrates. The Young Turk Revolution of 1908 had promised constitutional government and equal treatment for the empire's diverse ethnic and religious communities. But the reality in places like Karchemish was more complicated, as central authority weakened and local power relationships shifted in response to changing pressures from Istanbul. The Kurdish and Arab workers on the excavation talked freely about these developments in Lawrence's presence, partly because his growing fluency in Arabic allowed him to follow their conversations, but more importantly because his behavior had earned their trust. Unlike other Europeans they had encountered, Lawrence seemed genuinely interested in their perspectives rather than simply using them as sources of labor or information. This distinction was crucial in ways that Lawrence was only beginning to understand. The Ottoman Empire in its final decades was increasingly penetrated by European commercial and political interests that treated local populations as impediments to modernization or resources to be exploited. Archaeological expeditions, diplomatic missions, and commercial ventures all operated according to assumptions about European superiority that made genuine cultural exchange virtually impossible. Lawrence's approach was different not because he rejected these assumptions intellectually. His own letters from this period show that he remained very much a product of his time and class, but because his temperament and interests made him curious about how things looked from the other side. This curiosity, which had begun as academic interest in medieval history, was developing into something more complex and potentially dangerous: the ability to see his own culture as one option among many, rather than as the inevitable culmination of human progress. The archaeological work itself was proceeding brilliantly. The team was uncovering Hittite sculptures and inscriptions that provided new insights into a civilization that had controlled much of Anatolia and northern Syria during the Late Bronze Age. Lawrence's photographs and drawings were documenting finds that would reshape scholarly understanding of ancient Near Eastern history. But for Lawrence personally, the most significant discoveries were not archaeological. He was learning to see the contemporary Middle East not as a collection of romantic Oriental fantasies, but as a complex political and cultural landscape where different groups were competing for resources, autonomy, and survival under conditions of imperial decline and European interference. The outbreak of the Italo-Turkish War in 1911 brought these abstract political currents into sharp local focus. Ottoman forces were withdrawn from frontier regions like the Euphrates Valley to fight the Italians in Libya, leaving places like Karchemish with minimal central government presence. This created opportunities for local autonomy, but also increased the importance of informal power relationships and tribal alliances. Lawrence watched these developments with fascination that was both scholarly and personal. He was witnessing the breakdown of imperial authority that had maintained relative stability across vast territories for centuries. At the same time, he was seeing how local communities adapted to changing circumstances, how they preserved essential social functions even as formal political structures crumbled around them. During the winter months, when excavation work was suspended, Lawrence began making longer journeys into the surrounding countryside. These trips, ostensibly for archaeological survey, became opportunities for deeper cultural immersion. He would disappear for weeks at a time, traveling with Bedouin guides through territories that rarely saw European visitors, learning the routes and water sources that connected scattered communities across the Syrian desert. These journeys were transforming Lawrence in ways that would have been invisible to casual observation but were fundamental to his developing sense of identity. He was learning to navigate social worlds where his Oxford education and British citizenship were irrelevant, where survival and success depended on entirely different kinds of knowledge and skill. More subtly, he was discovering that he possessed talents for this kind of cultural shapeshifting that surprised even him. The Lawrence who returned to Karchemish each spring was becoming someone his Oxford friends would hardly have recognized. His skin was darkened by desert sun, his Arabic was fluent enough for sophisticated political discussion, his understanding of Middle Eastern geography extended far beyond what any map could provide. But the changes went deeper than surface adaptation. He was developing the capacity for multiple identities that would later make him invaluable to British intelligence and would ultimately destroy his peace of mind. The summer of 1914 found Lawrence at Karchemish, supervising excavations that had revealed layers of Hittite civilization extending back 3 millennia, when news arrived that would shatter the archaeological calm and reshape not only his life but the entire political landscape of the Middle East. Archduke Franz Ferdinand had been assassinated in Sarajevo, and across Europe, the great powers were mobilizing for what everyone believed would be a brief, decisive conflict. From the perspective of a small village on the Euphrates, these European developments seemed remote, almost theoretical. The Ottoman Empire had been declining for decades, losing territory to European powers and struggling with internal rebellions from Arab nationalists, Balkan peoples, and its own military officers. One more European crisis seemed unlikely to affect the daily rhythms of archaeological work or village life in northern Syria. But Lawrence had been observing Ottoman politics closely enough to understand that this crisis was different. The empire's leaders, faced with the choice between neutrality and alliance with one of the European power blocs, were leaning toward Germany, partly because German military advisors had been modernizing the Ottoman army, but more importantly because Germany seemed to offer the best hope for preserving Ottoman territories against Russian and British imperial ambitions. As reports arrived from Europe describing the mobilization of vast armies and the activation of alliance systems that would soon engulf the continent, Lawrence began to realize that the archaeological expedition to Carchemish might be ending not with the seasonal return to England, but with the collapse of the entire imperial framework that had made such expeditions possible. More immediately, he understood that British nationals working in Ottoman territory might soon find themselves enemy aliens in a country at war with their own government. The conversations he had been having with local Arab and Kurdish leaders about Ottoman politics suddenly acquired new urgency. If the empire aligned itself with Germany against Britain and France, the entire Middle East would become a theater of global conflict, with consequences that no one could predict. In August 1914, when the Ottoman Empire formally entered the war on the German side, the British Museum expedition to Carchemish was suspended indefinitely. Woolley and the other senior archaeologists prepared to return to England, where Woolley would soon be recruited for intelligence work. But Lawrence faced a different choice. His knowledge of Arabic, his understanding of tribal politics, and his network of contacts throughout Syria made him potentially valuable to British war efforts in ways that were only beginning to be understood. The decision to remain in the Middle East rather than returning to Oxford was not made all at once, but emerged from a series of conversations with British officials who were scrambling to understand how the war might develop in Ottoman territories. The British Empire's position in Egypt, its interests in Mesopotamian oil fields, and its strategic concerns about Ottoman threats to the Suez Canal all required intelligence about political conditions in Arab territories that most British officials knew only from outdated maps and Orientalist fantasies. Lawrence's unique qualifications for intelligence work lay not just in his language skills and regional knowledge, but in his demonstrated ability to move between cultures without losing the trust of either side. The Arab leaders he had come to know during his archaeological years saw him as someone who understood their concerns and respected their autonomy, while British officials recognized in him someone who could provide reliable information about a region that would soon become crucial to imperial strategy. In December 1914, Lawrence was formally recruited by British military intelligence and assigned to the Arab Bureau in Cairo, a newly created organization responsible for coordinating British policy toward the various Arab peoples within the Ottoman Empire. This assignment would have seemed like natural career progression for someone with his background and interests, but it represented a fundamental shift from archaeological scholarship to active participation in the reshaping of political boundaries across the Middle East. Cairo in the winter of 1914-15 was a city transformed by war. What had been a relatively sleepy imperial backwater, important mainly as the administrative center for British control of Egypt, had become the headquarters for military campaigns that would eventually extend from Gallipoli to Mesopotamia, from the Arabian Peninsula to the Palestinian coast. The Arab Bureau occupied modest offices in the Savoy Hotel, but its influence extended across territories where millions of Arabs were beginning to question their loyalty to an Ottoman Empire that had aligned itself with Germany against Britain and France. Lawrence's colleagues included some of the most knowledgeable Orientalists of their generation, men like David Hogarth, his former mentor from Oxford, and Gertrude Bell, whose travels through Mesopotamia had given her unparalleled knowledge of tribal politics among the desert Arabs. Lawrence's initial assignments were desk work, translating intercepted Ottoman communications, preparing maps of tribal territories, writing reports on political conditions and regions where British forces might operate. But this work required exactly the kind of cultural translation that he had been practicing, almost unconsciously, since his first journey to Syria. He had to take information gathered from Arab sources and present it in forms that British military and political officials could understand and act upon. This was more complex than simple linguistic translation. Arab political organization operated according to principles of kinship, honor, and reciprocal obligation that did not map easily onto European concepts of nationality, sovereignty, and bureaucratic administration. Lawrence found himself serving as interpreter not just of language but of entirely different ways of organizing political loyalty and military cooperation. Through the winter and spring of 1915, as British forces suffered catastrophic losses at Gallipoli and struggled to establish effective campaigns in Mesopotamia, the importance of potential Arab cooperation became increasingly clear. If the Arab peoples within the Ottoman Empire could be persuaded to rebel against Turkish rule, it might open new theaters of operation that would relieve pressure on other British campaigns while simultaneously weakening Ottoman forces across their extended empire. The problem was that British officials had little understanding of how Arab political loyalty actually operated, or what kinds of inducements might convince Arab leaders to risk their people's welfare in support of British war aims. Traditional European diplomacy, based on treaties between sovereign states and appeals to shared strategic interests, was poorly suited to negotiations with tribal leaders whose primary concerns were the survival and prosperity of their particular peoples rather than abstract geopolitical calculations. Lawrence's growing reputation within the Arab Bureau rested on his ability to bridge these different political languages. His reports demonstrated understanding of how Arab leaders made decisions, what kinds of assurances they would require before committing themselves to rebellion, how their internal politics might affect their reliability as military allies. But more than technical expertise, Lawrence was developing something that would prove crucial in the campaigns ahead: genuine respect for Arab political culture as a sophisticated system for managing human relationships under difficult circumstances, rather than as a primitive form of organization that needed to be replaced by European models of governance. This respect would make him unusually effective as a liaison between British and Arab interests, but it would also create the internal contradictions that would eventually tear him apart. He was serving an imperial system that viewed Arab independence as, at best, a temporary convenience to be discarded once British strategic objectives had been achieved. But his personal experience had convinced him that Arab political culture possessed wisdom and dignity that deserved recognition and protection. By the autumn of 1915, these abstract tensions were about to become concrete and personal. Reports were reaching Cairo of stirrings in the Hijaz, the western region of the Arabian Peninsula that contained the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. Hussein ibn Ali, the Sharif of Mecca and a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, was quietly communicating with British officials about the possibility of leading an Arab revolt against Ottoman rule. This was the opportunity that British strategists had been hoping for: a chance to open a new front against the Ottomans led by an Arab leader with the religious and political authority to unite the diverse tribes of the Arabian Peninsula. But translating this opportunity into effective military action would require British officers who could work directly with Arab forces, understanding their methods of warfare and their internal politics well enough to coordinate joint operations against Ottoman strongholds. Lawrence's name began appearing in memoranda and planning documents as someone uniquely qualified for this kind of liaison work. His combination of archaeological knowledge, linguistic ability, and cultural sensitivity had prepared him, almost accidentally, for a role that no traditional military training could have provided. The journey from Cairo to Jeddah in October 1916 took Lawrence across waters that had carried pilgrims, merchants, and conquerors for millennia: the Red Sea, that narrow channel between Africa and Arabia that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires since before recorded history began. Lawrence traveled aboard HMS Suva, a British warship whose presence in these waters represented the extension of European military power into regions that had remained largely independent of Western control. As the desert coastline of Arabia emerged from the morning haze, Lawrence experienced something that he would later struggle to put into words: a sense of approaching a landscape that was somehow more fundamental than the green hills of England or the limestone colleges of Oxford. The mountains that rose behind the coastal plain were bare stone and sand, sculpted by wind and time into forms that seemed to contain their own harsh logic, their own terrible beauty. Jeddah in 1916 was a city caught between worlds, its narrow streets filled with pilgrims from across the Islamic world who had come to fulfill the Hajj obligation of visiting Mecca, but also increasingly penetrated by European commercial and political interests that were reshaping the traditional patterns of Red Sea trade. Lawrence's first task was to assess the political situation in the Hijaz and evaluate the prospects for effective Arab military cooperation against Ottoman forces. The Arab Revolt had begun officially in June 1916, when Sharif Hussein proclaimed Arab independence from Ottoman rule and called upon Arab peoples throughout the empire to throw off Turkish domination. But the reality on the ground was far more complex than this proclamation suggested. Hussein's authority was primarily religious and ceremonial, his actual military forces were limited, and his control over the various Bedouin tribes was based on alliances that could shift rapidly in response to changing circumstances. Lawrence's first meetings with Arab leaders in Jeddah revealed the enormous gap between British expectations and Arab capabilities. British planners had hoped for disciplined military campaigns that could capture and hold Ottoman strongholds, cutting Turkish supply lines and forcing the redeployment of troops from other theaters. But Arab warfare operated according to different principles, emphasizing mobility, surprise, and the preservation of tribal fighting strength rather than the occupation of fixed positions. More fundamentally, Arab political organization was based on consent and negotiation rather than command and obedience. A tribal leader could not order his followers into battle the way a British colonel could order his regiment to advance. Every military operation required extensive consultation, the negotiation of terms that protected tribal interests, and the maintenance of consensus that could dissolve if circumstances changed. These differences were not simply matters of military technique, but reflected entirely different assumptions about the relationship between leaders and followers, about the purpose of warfare, about the obligations that individuals owed to their communities. Lawrence was beginning to understand that effective cooperation with Arab forces would require British officers to adapt their methods to Arab political culture, rather than trying to impose European military discipline on tribal warriors. His opportunity to test these insights came when he was invited to travel inland to meet Faisal, one of Sharif Hussein's sons who was leading Arab forces against the Ottoman garrison at Medina. The journey from Jeddah to Faisal's camp required crossing desert landscapes that seemed to exist outside human time, where the only landmarks were scattered wells and the ruins of ancient settlements long since abandoned to the sand. Lawrence made this journey in the company of Arab guides whose knowledge of the desert was so intimate that they could navigate by the smell of different types of sand, by the flight patterns of birds, by subtle variations in wind direction that were invisible to untrained eyes. For the first time, he began to understand the desert not as empty space to be crossed as quickly as possible, but as a complex environment that could support human life for those who understood its rhythms and resources. Faisal's camp, when Lawrence finally reached it after days of travel across terrain that seemed designed to discourage human ambition, was unlike anything he had encountered in his archaeological or intelligence work. It was not a fixed military base in the European sense, but a mobile community that could appear and disappear according to the strategic and logistical needs of desert warfare. The meeting between Lawrence and Faisal was one of those historical encounters that seems inevitable in retrospect but was actually the result of countless small decisions and accidents. Faisal was looking for European allies who could provide the weapons, supplies, and technical expertise that Arab forces needed to challenge Ottoman control of key cities and transportation routes. Lawrence was looking for Arab leaders who could coordinate their military operations with British strategic objectives in ways that would effectively support the broader Allied war effort. But the personal chemistry between the two men transcended these institutional purposes. Faisal recognized in Lawrence someone who approached Arab culture with respect rather than condescension, who was genuinely interested in understanding Arab methods of warfare and political organization rather than simply using Arab forces as auxiliary troops in British campaigns. Lawrence, for his part, found in Faisal a leader who combined traditional Arab political skills with sophisticated understanding of the broader international context within which the revolt was taking place. Faisal was not the romantic figure of European Orientalist fantasy, nor was he the backward tribal chieftain of colonial stereotype. He was a skilled politician managing complex relationships among diverse groups with competing interests, trying to create effective military cooperation while preserving the autonomy and welfare of the peoples he represented. The strategic situation that Lawrence found in Faisal's camp was both promising and precarious. Arab forces had succeeded in capturing several Ottoman posts and cutting Turkish communications along the Hijaz Railway, the vital link between Damascus and the holy cities that carried pilgrims, supplies, and military reinforcements. But they lacked the heavy weapons and technical expertise needed to capture major strongholds like Medina, and their irregular methods of warfare made coordinated campaigns difficult to sustain. More problematically, the various Arab forces were not unified under centralized command. Different tribal groups fought for different reasons, some from loyalty to Sharif Hussein's religious authority, others for payment in British gold, still others from traditional hostility to Ottoman taxation and military conscription. These diverse motivations could be coordinated temporarily for specific operations, but they created inherent limitations on the scale and duration of campaigns. Lawrence's first detailed reports to Cairo from Faisal's camp revealed his growing understanding that effective British support for the Arab revolt would require adapting British methods to Arab conditions rather than trying to transform Arab forces into conventional European-style armies. This was a radical departure from standard colonial practice, which typically involved training indigenous forces to fight according to European military doctrine. But Lawrence was beginning to argue that Arab methods of warfare were actually superior for the kind of campaign that needed to be fought against Ottoman forces in the Arabian Peninsula. Traditional European tactics emphasizing the capture and defense of fixed positions were poorly suited to desert warfare, where mobility and knowledge of local conditions were more important than superior firepower or disciplined formations. The Arab approach to warfare, emphasizing surprise attacks on vulnerable targets, rapid withdrawal to avoid counterattacks, and the preservation of fighting strength over territorial conquest, was ideally adapted to the desert environment and to the political structure of tribal military organization. Rather than trying to change these methods, Lawrence argued, British officers should learn from them and find ways to enhance their effectiveness through the provision of weapons, explosives, and technical advisors who could work within existing Arab command structures. This argument would eventually transform not only the Arab revolt but Lawrence's own role within it. Instead of remaining a liaison officer reporting back to Cairo, he would become a combat advisor working directly with Arab forces, participating in operations that would take him from the Red Sea coast to the outskirts of Damascus, from anonymous intelligence work to international celebrity, from promising young Orientalist to one of the most famous and tormented figures of his generation. The first time Lawrence participated directly in an Arab raid against Ottoman forces, in December 1916, he experienced a transformation that went far deeper than the tactical lessons he was supposed to be learning for his intelligence reports to Cairo. The target was a section of the Hijaz Railway near the station at Mutawara, where Turkish trains carried supplies and reinforcements between Damascus and the Ottoman garrison at Medina. The approach to the railway required a night march across desert terrain so desolate that it seemed like the surface of another planet, where scattered thorny shrubs cast shadows in starlight and the only sounds were the soft padding of camel feet and the distant cry of jackals hunting among the rocks. Lawrence rode with Bedouin raiders whose knowledge of this landscape was so intimate that they could find hidden water sources by the smell of the air, could predict weather changes hours in advance by subtle shifts in wind direction. The railway itself, when they finally reached it in the hour before dawn, represented something more than a transportation system. It was a line of steel and stone that carried the authority of the Ottoman state into territories that had remained largely autonomous for centuries. The regular passage of Turkish trains through Bedouin territory was an assertion of imperial control that challenged traditional patterns of tribal independence, and the Arab raids against these trains were therefore both military operations and symbolic acts of political resistance. Lawrence's role in the attack was officially limited to observation and advice, but the reality of desert warfare made such distinctions meaningless. When the explosive charges that he had helped to place detonated under a Turkish supply train, when Ottoman soldiers began firing from the wreckage while Arab raiders swept down from the surrounding ridges, he found himself not recording the engagement for later analysis but participating in it with an intensity that surprised him. The immediate tactical lessons were clear enough. Arab methods of warfare were indeed superior for this kind of operation, emphasizing mobility and surprise over the direct confrontation that European military doctrine would have prescribed. But Lawrence was also discovering something about himself that would prove both liberating and ultimately destructive. He possessed a talent for violence that seemed to emerge from sources deeper than his Oxford education or his archaeological training. In the chaos of combat, surrounded by the sound of rifle fire and the shouts of men fighting for their lives, Lawrence found that his academic knowledge of medieval warfare translated into intuitive understanding of tactics and terrain. More than that, he discovered that he could function effectively in circumstances where survival depended on split-second decisions made without the luxury of scholarly reflection. This discovery was both exhilarating and deeply disturbing. The pale, bookish Oxford undergraduate who had traveled to Syria to study Crusader castles was revealing capacities for leadership and violence that seemed to come from someone else entirely. When Arab raiders looked to him for tactical advice or technical assistance with explosives, he found himself responding with confidence and competence that felt simultaneously natural and alien. The successful destruction of the Turkish train brought Lawrence his first taste of the celebrity that would eventually overwhelm his life. Arab warriors who had initially viewed him as another European observer began treating him as a valuable combat advisor, someone whose technical knowledge could enhance the effectiveness of their traditional methods without compromising their tactical autonomy. More significantly, news of the raid reached British headquarters in Cairo as evidence that European officers could indeed work effectively with Arab forces in ways that enhanced rather than replaced indigenous military capabilities. Lawrence's reports from the field were being read by senior military and political officials who were looking for models that could be applied to other theaters of unconventional warfare. But the psychological impact of these experiences was more complex than Lawrence's official reports could convey. Each successful operation against Ottoman forces drew him deeper into a world where his Oxford identity became increasingly irrelevant, where survival and effectiveness depended on abilities he had not known he possessed. The desert campaigns of early 1917 took Lawrence and Faisal's forces across landscapes that seemed to exist outside historical time, where ancient caravan routes connected scattered oases that had supported human life since before the rise of Islam. At Wage, at Aqaba, at dozens of smaller engagements whose names would never appear in official military histories, Lawrence was learning to see warfare not as the collision of opposing armies but as a form of political communication conducted by other means. Arab raids against the Hijaz Railway were not attempts to destroy Ottoman power in the region. The rebels lacked the resources for such ambitious objectives, but rather efforts to demonstrate that Turkish authority was not absolute, that local populations had alternatives to imperial obedience. Each successful attack encouraged other tribes to consider rebellion, while each Turkish reprisal against civilian populations drove more Arabs toward active resistance. Lawrence's understanding of this political dimension of desert warfare was enhanced by his growing personal relationships with the Arab leaders and fighters who had become his comrades. Men like Atta Abu Tay, the legendary Hawattat chief whose knowledge of desert warfare was legendary even among the Bedouin, treated Lawrence not as a foreign advisor but as a trusted ally whose counsel was worth seeking and whose judgment could be relied upon in crisis. These relationships were based on demonstrated competence rather than formal authority, on personal loyalty rather than institutional hierarchy. Lawrence was learning to operate within Arab political culture not by abandoning his European background but by finding ways to synthesize his technical knowledge with traditional Bedouin methods of leadership and decision-making. But this cultural synthesis was taking a psychological toll that Lawrence was only beginning to understand. Each operation that required him to function as an Arab military leader rather than a British intelligence officer moved him further from the identity he had constructed during his Oxford years. The scholarly detachment that had made his archaeological work possible was becoming impossible to maintain when survival depended on emotional investment in outcomes that could mean life or death for men he had come to respect and care about. The planning for the attack on Aqaba, which would become Lawrence's most famous military achievement, revealed the full extent of his transformation from observer to participant. The Ottoman port city commanded the northern end of the Red Sea and served as a crucial link in Turkish supply lines supporting their forces in southern Palestine. Capturing Aqaba would not only eliminate this strategic asset but would also provide Arab forces with a secure base for operations against Ottoman communications throughout the region. The conventional military approach to capturing Aqaba would have involved a direct assault from the sea, supported by British naval gunfire and European-trained assault troops. But Lawrence and his Arab allies developed a radically different strategy that reflected their growing understanding of how desert warfare could exploit Ottoman weaknesses rather than challenging Turkish strengths directly. Instead of attacking Aqaba from the sea, where Ottoman defenses were strongest, they would approach from the supposedly impassable desert to the east, crossing terrain that Turkish military planners had dismissed as too difficult for large military formations. This approach would require a march of several hundred miles across some of the most forbidding landscape on Earth, but it would bring Arab forces against Aqaba's landward defenses, which had been designed to repel Bedouin raids rather than coordinated military campaigns. The success of this strategy would depend entirely on Lawrence's ability to function not as a British officer commanding Arab troops, but as a trusted partner in an enterprise that combined European technical knowledge with traditional Bedouin expertise in desert survival and irregular warfare. The march to Aqaba began in May 1917, when Lawrence and a small force of Arab irregulars set out from Wage across desert terrain that challenged every assumption about what human endurance could accomplish. The route they followed had been used by Bedouin raiders for centuries, but never by a military expedition carrying the weapons, supplies, and explosive materials necessary to capture and hold a fortified position. The landscape through which they traveled seemed designed to discourage human ambition, vast expanses of black volcanic rock broken by occasional wadis where flash floods had carved temporary channels through stone harder than steel. During the day, temperatures rose to levels that made movement dangerous, metal objects became too hot to touch, and even the Bedouin guides sought shelter among rock formations that provided minimal shade. At night, when the desert cold was sharp enough to freeze water in their goatskin bags, Lawrence learned lessons about survival that no European education could have provided. He discovered that the Bedouin knowledge of desert travel was not simply practical information about routes and water sources, but a complete system for maintaining life in an environment that was fundamentally hostile to human presence. The Arab fighters who accompanied him on this journey represented a cross-section of tribal politics throughout the region: Hawattat warriors loyal to Wada Abu Tay, Beni Sak riders whose knowledge of northern territories would be crucial for the approach to Aqaba, and smaller groups from tribes whose participation in the revolt was still tentative, dependent on the success of operations like this one. Managing the internal politics of such a diverse force required Lawrence to function simultaneously as military advisor, diplomatic liaison, and cultural interpreter. Decisions about routes, tactics, and timing had to be negotiated among leaders whose authority rested on different sources, some traditional, some religious, some based purely on demonstrated competence in warfare or desert survival. Lawrence's role in these negotiations was paradoxical in ways that he was only beginning to understand. His European background and British connections gave him access to resources, gold, weapons, explosives, that were crucial for military success. But his effectiveness as a leader depended on his ability to subordinate these advantages to Arab political and military culture, to function as a facilitator rather than a commander. The approach to Aqaba itself required crossing the Nafud, a region of sand dunes and rocky outcroppings where Ottoman forces had never attempted to establish permanent control. Turkish military intelligence had dismissed this route as impassable for any force large enough to threaten their positions, but Lawrence and his Arab allies were demonstrating that European assumptions about desert warfare were fundamentally flawed. The final approach to Aqaba in early July 1917 revealed the extent to which Lawrence had internalized Arab methods of military leadership. Rather than issuing orders according to European command structures, he participated in the collective decision-making processes that Arab military culture used to coordinate complex operations among autonomous fighting groups. The assault on Aqaba itself was over almost before it began. Ottoman defenders, caught completely unprepared for an attack from the landward side, surrendered after minimal resistance. But the political and strategic consequences of the victory extended far beyond the immediate military achievement. Lawrence's success at Aqaba demonstrated that European and Arab military methods could be combined in ways that produced results neither could have achieved alone. More importantly, it established his reputation among Arab leaders as someone whose counsel was worth seeking, whose judgment could be trusted in matters of life and death. But the psychological impact of these achievements was more complex than the official celebrations could acknowledge. Lawrence was discovering that success in Arab military culture required not just tactical competence but emotional investment in relationships and outcomes that connected him to his comrades in ways that transcended professional obligation. The men who had marched with him to Aqaba were no longer foreign allies or intelligence sources, but comrades whose welfare had become as important to him as his own survival. This emotional transformation made him more effective as a military leader, but it also created internal conflicts that would eventually prove unbearable. His reports to British headquarters in Cairo during the summer of 1917 reflected this growing tension between his institutional loyalties and his personal commitments. Officially, he was still a British intelligence officer whose primary obligation was to support Allied strategic objectives in the Middle Eastern theater. But his effectiveness in that role increasingly depended on his ability to represent Arab interests with authenticity and conviction. The success at Aqaba brought Lawrence to the attention of senior British military and political leaders who were looking for models of colonial warfare that could be applied in other theaters. His methods of working with indigenous forces while maintaining European tactical advantages seemed to offer solutions to problems that traditional imperial administration had failed to resolve. But Lawrence was beginning to understand that his success among the Arabs was based precisely on his rejection of traditional colonial relationships. Arab leaders trusted him not because he represented British power effectively, but because he had demonstrated genuine respect for Arab political culture and commitment to Arab welfare. The planning for subsequent operations, the raids against the Hijaz Railway, the coordination with British forces advancing through Palestine, the gradual expansion of Arab control throughout southern Syria required Lawrence to manage increasingly complex relationships between British strategic objectives and Arab political aspirations. These relationships were becoming more difficult to maintain as the scope of military operations expanded and the political stakes of ultimate victory became clearer. British policy toward post-war arrangements in the Middle East was still being formulated, but Lawrence's access to confidential communications gave him knowledge of plans that would profoundly disappoint Arab expectations of independence and autonomy. The Balfour Declaration, issued in November 1917, promised British support for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, a commitment that directly contradicted earlier British assurances to Arab leaders about post-war Arab independence in the same territories. Lawrence found himself in the impossible position of maintaining Arab confidence and military cooperation while knowing that British policy was being developed in ways that would ultimately betray Arab trust. This knowledge was eating away at the psychological foundations that had made his effectiveness possible. The Lawrence who had marched to Aqaba with complete confidence in the compatibility of British and Arab interests was being replaced by someone who understood that he was participating in a deception whose consequences would extend far beyond the immediate military campaign. The internal contradictions of his position were becoming visible in ways that affected his relationships with both British superiors and Arab comrades. His reports to Cairo began to include increasingly urgent warnings about the political costs of British duplicity, while his interactions with Arab leaders required ever more careful management to maintain the trust that effective military cooperation demanded. But the momentum of military success made it impossible to step back from commitments that were driving him toward psychological breakdown. Each victory against Ottoman forces expanded Arab expectations of post-war independence, while each new British policy directive made it clearer that those expectations would not be fulfilled. The campaigns of 1918 that would culminate in the Arab capture of Damascus began with Lawrence managing military operations across territories that stretched from the Red Sea to the outskirts of Aleppo, coordinating the activities of tribal forces whose political relationships were as complex as the desert landscapes they controlled. His headquarters, when he maintained one at all, might be a Bedouin tent that could be packed and moved within an hour, or a captured Turkish blockhouse whose stone walls still bore the scars of recent fighting. The strategic situation had evolved dramatically since the early days of the revolt, when Arab forces had been limited to raids against isolated railway stations and small Ottoman outposts. British advances through Palestine under General Allenby had created opportunities for coordinated operations that could link Arab irregular warfare with conventional military campaigns, potentially leading to the complete collapse of Ottoman authority throughout the region. But the political complexities of these joint operations were becoming increasingly difficult for Lawrence to manage, as his roles as British liaison officer and Arab military advisor pulled him in directions that could not be reconciled indefinitely. Arab leaders were fighting for the independence that British officials had promised them, while British policy was being developed according to imperial interests that would require continued European control over much of the Middle East. Lawrence's knowledge of these contradictions was affecting his ability to function effectively in either capacity. His Arab comrades noticed changes in his behavior that they attributed to the stress of prolonged combat, while his British superiors found his reports increasingly critical of policies that he had once supported without reservation. The psychological pressure was intensified by the nature of desert warfare itself, which required Lawrence to function simultaneously as European technical advisor and Arab tribal leader, switching between cultural identities in ways that were becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. In morning conferences with British officers, he would discuss logistics and communications using the professional vocabulary of modern military science. By afternoon, he might be participating in traditional Bedouin councils where decisions were made through elaborate processes of consultation and consensus building. The most serious challenge came during the planning for operations that would support Allenby's final offensive against Ottoman forces in Palestine and southern Syria. These campaigns required unprecedented coordination between regular British troops and Arab irregular forces, with Lawrence serving as the primary link between command structures that operated according to fundamentally different assumptions about military authority and political obligation. The success of these joint operations depended on Lawrence's ability to maintain the trust of Arab leaders while implementing strategic decisions made by British commanders who had minimal understanding of Arab political culture or military capabilities. This required him to translate not just between languages but between entire worldviews, to present British strategic objectives in terms that Arab leaders could accept while ensuring that Arab military contributions served broader Allied purposes. The approach to Damascus in September 1918 represented the culmination of everything Lawrence had learned about the possibilities and limitations of cultural synthesis in military operations. The ancient city had been the seat of the Umayyad Caliphate, the center of Arab civilization during its golden age, and its capture by Arab forces would have symbolic significance that extended far beyond immediate military advantages. But the coordination required to capture Damascus revealed the full extent of the contradictions that Lawrence had been managing throughout the campaign. Arab forces were fighting for the restoration of Arab independence under leaders they respected and trusted, while British forces were fighting for strategic objectives that would ultimately require the establishment of European mandates over Arab territories. Lawrence found himself implementing tactical decisions that he knew would contribute to political outcomes that violated his personal commitments to his Arab comrades. The capture of Damascus by Arab forces, which he helped to plan and execute, would be used to legitimize Arab claims to independence, but he knew that British policy would ultimately deny those claims in favor of arrangements that served European imperial interests. The entry into Damascus on October 1, 1918, was simultaneously the greatest triumph and the beginning of the final disillusionment for Lawrence. Arab forces, supported by British cavalry and artillery, swept into the city as Ottoman authority collapsed across the region. For a few days, it seemed as though the promises of Arab independence might actually be fulfilled. Lawrence participated in the establishment of the Provisional Arab Government that took control of Damascus under Faisal's leadership, helping to organize administrative structures that would demonstrate Arab capacity for self-government. But even as he worked to make these arrangements effective, he was receiving communications from British headquarters that made it clear they were temporary expedients, designed to maintain order until more permanent arrangements could be imposed. The psychological impact of this knowledge, combined with the cumulative stress of years of combat and cultural displacement, was beginning to manifest in ways that affected Lawrence's ability to function. Colleagues noticed that he seemed increasingly detached from immediate circumstances, as if he were observing events from outside himself rather than participating in them directly. The administrative work required to establish Arab civil government in Damascus provided Lawrence with his first opportunity in years to step back from immediate military operations and reflect on what he had accomplished and what it had cost him. The reflection was not comfortable. He was beginning to understand that his effectiveness as a liaison between British and Arab interests had depended on his ability to suppress his growing awareness of the contradictions between them. The success of the Arab revolt had made him internationally famous, but it had also trapped him in a public identity that bore little relationship to his private experience. The Lawrence of Arabia celebrated in newspaper accounts was a romantic hero who had brought European military expertise to noble Bedouin warriors fighting for freedom against Ottoman oppression. The actual Lawrence was a deeply conflicted individual whose most significant achievement had been learning to function within Arab political culture in ways that his own government would ultimately betray. As the immediate military crisis passed and attention turned to post-war political arrangements, Lawrence found himself facing choices that had been postponed throughout the campaign. He could continue serving as a liaison between British authorities and Arab leaders, helping to implement policies that he knew would disappoint Arab expectations. Or he could attempt to return to the scholarly life that had been interrupted by the war, though he was no longer the person who had set out to study Crusader castles in Syria nearly a decade earlier. The man who had entered Damascus with the Arab army was someone whose identity had been fundamentally altered by his experiences, but whose public reputation was becoming increasingly disconnected from his private reality. The legend of Lawrence of Arabia was beginning to acquire a life of its own, independent of the complex, troubled individual who had provided its inspiration. The return to England in the autumn of 1918 brought Lawrence face to face with a celebrity that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. The British press had transformed his military achievements into a romantic adventure story that bore little resemblance to the complex political and military realities he had actually experienced in the desert campaigns. Newspaper accounts described him as a mysterious figure who had appeared from nowhere to lead Arab armies to victory against overwhelming odds, a modern crusader who had redeemed British honor in the East through personal courage and tactical brilliance. These stories emphasized elements of his experience that fit familiar narratives of imperial adventure while ignoring the political contradictions that had made his actual achievement possible. The Lawrence who walked through London streets in the winter of 1918-19 found himself simultaneously famous and invisible, celebrated for accomplishments that had been fundamentally misunderstood by the very people who claimed to honor them. His friends from Oxford days hardly recognized him. The pale, bookish undergraduate had been replaced by a man whose eyes carried memories of experiences that could not be shared with people who had never left England. More troubling was his growing awareness that the public version of his story was becoming more real, in political terms, than the private truth he carried. Government officials and military leaders who sought his advice about Middle Eastern affairs were influenced more by the romantic Lawrence of newspaper accounts than by his actual analysis of Arab political culture and the likely consequences of British policy decisions. The Paris Peace Conference, where the post-war settlement was being negotiated, provided Lawrence with his first opportunity since Damascus to advocate directly for Arab interests in European political forums. He traveled to France as part of the British delegation, but also as an unofficial representative of Arab aspirations for independence, carrying with him the weight of personal commitments made during years of shared danger and sacrifice. Lawrence's attempts to present Arab perspectives in these discussions were handicapped by his peculiar position as both British official and Arab advocate. European negotiators found it easier to dismiss his arguments as the romantic enthusiasm of someone who had been too long in the desert than to grapple seriously with the political and ethical problems that his analysis raised. The mandate system that emerged from these negotiations represented exactly the kind of compromise that Lawrence had learned to fear during his years in the Middle East, arrangements that satisfied European imperial interests while creating the appearance of responding to indigenous political aspirations. Britain and France would administer former Ottoman territories under League of Nations mandates that theoretically prepared these regions for eventual independence, but which in practice established European control for indefinite periods. Lawrence understood better than most European officials how Arab leaders would respond to these arrangements, and his predictions of political instability and violent resistance were proving accurate even before the mandates were formally implemented. But his warnings were dismissed as the pessimism of someone who had become too attached to Arab interests to provide objective analysis of British imperial requirements. The psychological impact of these political defeats was intensified by Lawrence's growing fame as a popular hero whose exploits were being chronicled in books, articles, and eventually films that bore decreasing relationship to his actual experiences. Publishers offered substantial sums for his memoirs, lecture agents proposed tours that would take him across Britain and America, and government officials suggested positions that would capitalize on his reputation while keeping him usefully employed in imperial service. But Lawrence found himself increasingly unable to function in any of these roles, as the gap between his public reputation and private reality created pressures that affected every aspect of his daily life. The scholarly detachment that had once allowed him to observe and analyze complex situations was impossible to maintain when he was simultaneously the subject of that analysis and its most conflicted critic. His decision to write 7 Pillars of Wisdom, the memoir that would become the definitive account of the Arab Revolt, represented both an attempt to set the historical record straight and a form of psychological self-torture that would occupy him for years. The process of writing forced him to relive experiences that he was trying to forget, while the need to shape those experiences into coherent narrative required him to impose meanings on events whose significance remained fundamentally ambiguous. The early drafts of 7 Pillars revealed the full complexity of Lawrence's psychological situation. He was trying simultaneously to celebrate the achievements of his Arab comrades, to acknowledge his own role in those achievements, and to confess his complicity in the betrayal of Arab trust that had made those achievements politically meaningless. The book that eventually emerged from this process was unlike any military memoir ever written, combining detailed tactical analysis with psychological introspection, anthropological observation with personal confession. But the act of writing it required Lawrence to inhabit, over and over again, the contradictions that had made his wartime role possible and were now making peacetime existence unbearable. His attempts to escape from the burden of his reputation through anonymity and service in the ranks of the Royal Air Force represented a desperate effort to recover some version of the identity he had possessed before the war transformed him into a public symbol. But even as aircraftman Shaw or Private Ross, he found that the psychological changes produced by his wartime experiences could not be undone by changes of name or occupation. The man who had learned to function simultaneously as European technical advisor and Arab military leader had acquired abilities that made ordinary peacetime existence feel like an elaborate form of pretense. His capacity for cultural shapeshifting, which had been invaluable during the desert campaigns, made it difficult for him to maintain stable relationships with people who knew him in only one context. More fundamentally, his experience of participating in events of genuine historical significance had left him unable to find meaning in the ordinary concerns of peacetime civilian life. The intensity of desert warfare, where decisions made in moments of crisis had consequences that extended across entire regions, had created psychological expectations that could not be satisfied by routine military service or scholarly research. The Lawrence who emerged from the war was someone whose most significant achievement, learning to bridge the gap between European and Arab political culture, had become the source of his deepest psychological conflicts. He had succeeded too well in his synthesis of different cultural identities. The Lawrence who emerged from the war was someone whose most significant achievement, learning to bridge the gap between European and Arab political culture, had become the source of his deepest psychological conflicts. He had succeeded too well in his synthesis of different cultural identities, creating within himself contradictions that could not be resolved through any external change of circumstances. His correspondence from this period reveals a man struggling with forms of guilt and displacement that had no clear remedy. He felt responsible for the political disappointments that Arab leaders were experiencing as the mandate system was implemented, but he also understood that his individual actions could not have altered the fundamental imperial logic that had produced those disappointments. The transformation of Thomas Edward Lawrence into the anonymous aircraftman Shaw began in the summer of 1922, when he walked into a Royal Air Force recruiting station in London and attempted to enlist under a false name. The recruiting sergeant who processed his application could not have imagined that the slight, nervous man claiming to be John Hume Ross was the most famous military figure of the recent war, the Lawrence of Arabia whose exploits had filled newspapers and captured popular imagination across the English-speaking world. Lawrence's motivation for this extraordinary step was complex beyond anything he could have explained to military authorities or even to himself. On the surface, he claimed to be seeking the anonymity and simple routine that would allow him to escape from the burden of celebrity that had made normal life impossible. But the psychological dynamics driving his flight from fame were rooted in contradictions that no change of identity could resolve. The man who had once moved seamlessly between the roles of Oxford scholar, British intelligence officer, and Arab military leader was discovering that peacetime existence offered no equivalent outlet for the cultural shape-shifting abilities that had defined his wartime effectiveness. In the regimented environment of RAF barracks, surrounded by working-class recruits whose backgrounds and concerns were entirely foreign to his experience, he found a form of exile that seemed to match his internal displacement. But even as aircraftman Shaw, Lawrence could not escape the psychological consequences of his wartime experiences. His fellow recruits, unaware of his true identity, were puzzled by behaviors that reflected his years of command responsibility and cross-cultural navigation. He spoke Arabic in his sleep, maintained habits of observation and analysis that were inappropriate for his nominal rank, and displayed knowledge of military affairs that seemed inexplicable for someone with his official background. More problematically, the physical and psychological disciplines of military training awakened memories and responses that he was trying to suppress. The controlled violence of combat exercises, the emphasis on unquestioning obedience to superior authority, the reduction of individual identity to functional role within larger organizational structure, all these elements of military life resonated with experiences that had shaped his transformation in the desert. Lawrence's service records from this period, declassified decades later, reveal the extent to which his attempts at anonymity were undermined by his inability to function convincingly as an ordinary enlisted man. His commanding officers noted behaviors that suggested previous military experience at levels far beyond what his official records indicated, while his fellow airmen observed habits and knowledge that seemed to belong to someone from an entirely different social and educational background. The discovery of his true identity, when it came, was almost inevitable given the impossibility of completely suppressing a personality that had been shaped by experiences so far outside the normal range of human possibility. But the exposure of aircraftman Shaw as Lawrence of Arabia created a media sensation that made his original celebrity seem modest by comparison. Newspaper reporters who had been following rumors about Lawrence's whereabouts discovered in his attempted anonymity a story even more compelling than his wartime exploits. The hero who had conquered the desert and entered Damascus in triumph was now scrubbing floors and following orders from sergeants who would have been his subordinates during the Arab campaigns. The apparent contradiction between his past achievements and present circumstances seemed to demand explanations that Lawrence was unwilling to provide. His discharge from the RAF under his assumed name was followed by a brief period of civilian life that proved even more unbearable than military service had been. Without the structure and routine that institutional life provided, Lawrence found himself confronting directly the psychological conflicts that military discipline had helped to suppress. The completion of 7 Pillars of Wisdom during this period represented both his most significant literary achievement and a form of psychological self-examination that intensified rather than resolved his internal conflicts. The process of writing forced him to inhabit, repeatedly and systematically, the experiences that had created his reputation while simultaneously acknowledging the ways in which that reputation misrepresented the reality of what he had accomplished and what it had cost him. The book that emerged from this tortured process was unlike any previous work of military memoir or Middle Eastern travel literature. Lawrence combined detailed tactical analysis with anthropological observation, political commentary with personal confession, creating a text that was simultaneously epic narrative and psychological case study. But the literary success of 7 Pillars only intensified the problem it had been intended to resolve. Critics and readers who praised the book's literary merits and historical insights were responding to the very public identity that Lawrence was trying to escape. The more successfully he articulated his experiences in the desert, the more firmly he became trapped within the legend those experiences had created. His decision to enlist again, this time in the Tank Corps under the name T.E. Shaw, represented another attempt to find institutional structure that would provide escape from the psychological burden of his reputation. But the Tank Corps proved even less suitable than the RAF for someone whose wartime experiences had created expectations and responses that could not be satisfied by routine military service. The training exercises and mechanical work that occupied his days as Private Shaw seemed like elaborate forms of play acting compared to the life-and-death decisions he had made during the Arab campaigns. His fellow soldiers, like his RAF comrades, were puzzled by behaviors that reflected knowledge and experience far beyond what his official background suggested, while his superior officers found themselves dealing with an enlisted man whose understanding of military affairs was more sophisticated than their own. Lawrence's letters from this period reveal someone struggling with forms of depression and alienation that had no clear external cause. He was physically healthy, financially secure through his writing, and surrounded by people who, unaware of his true identity, treated him with the ordinary camaraderie that he claimed to seek. But the psychological foundations of his identity had been so fundamentally altered by his wartime experiences that he could no longer function comfortably in any social context. His eventual return to the RAF, where he would spend the final years of his life working on the development of high-speed rescue boats, represented a form of compromise with circumstances that could not be resolved through any external change. As aircraftman Shaw, he found meaningful technical work that used his intellectual abilities without requiring him to inhabit the public role of Lawrence of Arabia. But even this final refuge was complicated by the continued public fascination with his story and the impossibility of completely separating his present circumstances from his past achievements. Colleagues who discovered his identity found it difficult to treat him as an ordinary airman, while his own psychological responses to routine military situations were shaped by memories that he could neither share nor entirely suppress. The man who had once coordinated complex military operations across hundreds of miles of desert territory was now following orders from superiors whose experience and understanding were limited to the narrow requirements of peacetime military service. The reversal seemed to provide the anonymity and simplicity he had claimed to seek, but it also created new forms of internal contradiction that were as difficult to manage as the celebrity he had tried to escape. Lawrence's technical work on rescue boat development during his final RAF years provided him with his last opportunity to find meaningful application for abilities that had been developed during his wartime experiences. The design challenges involved in creating boats that could operate effectively in dangerous conditions required exactly the kind of systematic analysis and practical problem-solving that had made him valuable as a military advisor in the desert. But even this work was shadowed by the knowledge that his most significant achievements lay in the past, and that his present circumstances, however comfortable or technically interesting, represented a form of exile from the historical events that had given his life its deepest meaning. The Lawrence who worked on boat designs in RAF workshops was using only a fraction of abilities that had once coordinated the activities of tribal armies across territories larger than most European countries. The cottage at Clouds Hill, purchased by Lawrence in 1925 as a retreat from the communal life of RAF barracks, became the physical embodiment of the contradictions that had defined his existence since returning from the desert. The small stone building, tucked into the Dorset countryside among heather and gorse, offered the solitude and simplicity that he claimed to value above all else, but it also isolated him from the human connections that might have provided meaning for his post-war years. Lawrence furnished Clouds Hill with the sparse functionality of someone who had learned to value possessions only for their immediate utility. A few books, carefully chosen for their literary merit rather than their scholarly importance. Simple furniture that could serve multiple purposes. No decorations that might suggest attachment to particular places or relationships. The cottage was designed for someone who wished to exist as lightly as possible, leaving minimal trace of his presence in the world. But the very act of creating this refuge revealed the impossibility of the anonymity that Lawrence thought he sought. Clouds Hill became a destination for the writers, politicians, and military officers who remained fascinated by his story and sought access to perspectives that only he could provide. His retreat from public life paradoxically made him more interesting to the kinds of people who were capable of tracking him down despite his efforts at concealment. The visitors who found their way to Clouds Hill discovered a man whose conversation revealed the full extent of his transformation from the Oxford undergraduate who had set out to study Crusader castles 30 years earlier. Lawrence's knowledge of Middle Eastern politics, military strategy, and cross-cultural dynamics had been refined by experiences that no academic training could have provided, but his ability to apply this knowledge had been limited by circumstances that made meaningful action impossible. His correspondence from the Clouds Hill years shows someone struggling with the recognition that his most significant achievements lay permanently in the past, while his present circumstances offered no outlet for abilities that had been developed under conditions of extraordinary pressure and responsibility. The man who had once made decisions that affected the political development of entire regions was now following orders from RAF sergeants whose understanding of the world was bounded by the requirements of routine maintenance work. The contrast was particularly acute because Lawrence's wartime experiences had demonstrated to him the possibility of meaningful individual action in circumstances where personal choices could have historical consequences. The decisions he had made during the Arab campaigns about tactics, alliances, and political arrangements had shaped events in ways that extended far beyond his individual circumstances. But peacetime existence offered no equivalent opportunities for consequential action. This recognition was complicated by his growing awareness that even his wartime achievements had been more ambiguous than either his supporters or critics acknowledged. The Arab revolt had succeeded in its immediate military objectives, but the political outcomes that Lawrence had hoped to influence had been determined by imperial considerations that made his individual contributions largely irrelevant. His final years were marked by increasingly desperate attempts to find some form of meaningful activity that would justify his continued existence without requiring him to inhabit the public role of Lawrence of Arabia. The technical work on rescue boat development provided temporary satisfaction, but it was clearly inadequate as a permanent solution to problems that were fundamentally psychological rather than practical. Lawrence's growing interest in literature during this period represented another attempt to find expression for experiences that could not be communicated through conventional means. His translations of classical texts, his correspondence with contemporary writers, and his continued revisions of 7 Pillars of Wisdom all reflected efforts to create some permanent record of insights that had been gained at extraordinary personal cost. But even his literary work was complicated by the celebrity that made it impossible for him to function as an ordinary writer seeking to communicate with readers who shared his cultural background and assumptions. Everything he wrote was interpreted in light of his reputation as Lawrence of Arabia, which meant that his attempts at honest self-examination were received as either heroic confession or romantic adventure, depending on the predispositions of his audience. The psychological pressure created by this situation was intensified by Lawrence's awareness that he possessed knowledge and perspectives that were genuinely valuable for understanding political developments in the Middle East, but that his public reputation made it difficult for him to contribute to policy discussions in ways that would be taken seriously by the officials who were making decisions about the region's future. His predictions about the long-term consequences of the mandate system, his warnings about the political instability that would result from the arbitrary boundaries drawn by European negotiators, and his analysis of the factors that would shape Arab responses to continued European control were all proving accurate. But his insights were dismissed as the romantic pessimism of someone who had become too attached to Arab interests to provide objective analysis of British imperial requirements. The final irony of Lawrence's situation was that his very success in understanding Arab political culture had made him suspect to British officials who were implementing policies based on assumptions that he knew to be fundamentally flawed. His cultural shapeshifting abilities, which had made him invaluable during wartime, became liabilities in peacetime circumstances where loyalty was defined by the consistency of one's identification with British interests. The man who had once coordinated military operations between forces that operated according to entirely different political and cultural assumptions found himself unable to maintain relationships with people who knew him in only one context. His Arab comrades remembered him as Orange, the European who had learned to function within their political culture while maintaining access to British resources. His British colleagues remembered him as the romantic figure who had achieved impossible victories through personal courage and tactical brilliance. But Lawrence himself had become someone who could no longer inhabit either identity convincingly, because his wartime experiences had created psychological structures that could not be sustained without the external pressures that had originally shaped them. The cultural synthesis that had made him effective as a liaison between British and Arab interests had required constant negotiation between contradictory loyalties and assumptions, and peacetime circumstances offered no equivalent challenge that could justify the psychological effort required to maintain such complex internal relationships. His growing isolation during the final years reflected not just personal depression but the structural impossibility of integrating experiences that had been shaped by circumstances that no longer existed. The Lawrence who had learned to see political problems from multiple cultural perspectives simultaneously was living in a world where such flexibility was not only unnecessary but potentially dangerous to the simplified identities that peacetime social life required. The motorcycle that would ultimately kill him had become, during his final years, both practical transportation and symbolic expression of the speed and danger that had characterized his wartime existence. The powerful machine allowed him to travel between his cottage and his RAF duties with the same kind of calculated risk that had defined his approach to desert warfare, where survival depended on the precise management of controllable dangers in circumstances where safety was impossible. But the motorcycle also represented his continuing need for experiences that matched the intensity of the life he had lived during the Arab campaigns, when every decision had consequences that extended beyond personal survival to affect the welfare of communities and the outcome of military operations. The physical sensation of high-speed travel provided temporary access to psychological states that had once been sustained by the genuine life-and-death responsibilities of military leadership. On the morning of May 13, 1935, Lawrence left Clouds Hill on his motorcycle to send telegrams from the post office in nearby Bovington Camp, a routine errand that had occupied his attention countless times during his final years of RAF service. The road he traveled was familiar, winding through Dorset countryside that had provided him with the closest approximation to peace he had known since returning from the desert campaigns that had made him famous. The accident that would end his life occurred when he swerved to avoid two cyclists on a hill near his cottage, losing control of the powerful machine that had become both his refuge from celebrity and his connection to the intensity that had once defined his existence. He lingered for 6 days in a military hospital, unconscious, while newspapers across Britain and the Empire prepared obituaries that would once again transform his complex reality into the simplified narrative of heroic achievement that he had spent his final years trying to escape. The man who died in that hospital bed was neither the romantic figure of popular legend nor the tortured neurotic that some critics had claimed to see beneath the heroic facade. He was someone whose most significant achievement had been learning to function simultaneously within different cultural systems, creating forms of synthesis that had proved temporarily effective but ultimately unsustainable. Lawrence's death at the age of 46 marked the end of a life that had been fundamentally shaped by the collision between 19th-century imperial certainties and 20th-century recognition of cultural complexity. He had grown up in an England where European superiority was taken for granted, where the civilizing mission of Western imperial powers seemed to provide clear justification for the control of less technologically advanced peoples. But his experiences in the Middle East had demonstrated to him that cultural differences were not simply matters of technological development or political sophistication, but reflected entirely different ways of organizing human relationships and understanding the proper relationship between individuals and communities. Arab political culture, he had learned, was not a primitive version of European democracy but a sophisticated system for managing social cooperation under conditions that made European-style centralized authority impossible to maintain. This recognition had made him effective as a liaison between British and Arab forces during wartime, when the immediate requirements of military cooperation could temporarily suppress the fundamental contradictions between imperial control and indigenous autonomy. But peacetime circumstances had forced him to confront the impossibility of reconciling his personal commitments to Arab welfare with his institutional loyalty to British imperial interests. The legend that emerged from his death, like the celebrity that had tormented his final years, emphasized elements of his experience that fit familiar narratives of individual heroism while ignoring the political and cultural complexities that had given his achievements their genuine significance. Lawrence of Arabia became a symbol of romantic adventure, of the possibility that exceptional individuals could transcend the limitations of their historical circumstances through personal courage and tactical brilliance. But the real Lawrence had discovered something more disturbing and more important, that cultural understanding across fundamental differences was possible but came at psychological costs that few individuals could sustain indefinitely. His success in learning to function within Arab political culture had required him to develop forms of identity that were incompatible with the social expectations of his own background, creating internal contradictions that no external change of circumstances could resolve. His predictions about the consequences of European policy in the region proved remarkably accurate, as the arbitrary nation-states created by British and French administrators struggled to maintain legitimacy among populations whose political loyalties were organized according to tribal, religious, and kinship relationships that transcended the boundaries drawn in European capitals. The conflicts that would define Middle Eastern politics throughout the remainder of the 20th century were, in many cases, direct consequences of the failure to understand the cultural dynamics that Lawrence had learned to navigate during his wartime service. But perhaps his most significant legacy lay not in his political or military achievements but in his demonstration of the psychological costs of genuine cultural synthesis. Lawrence had shown that it was possible for individuals to develop the kind of cross-cultural understanding that could bridge fundamental differences in worldview and social organization, but his experience had also revealed that such understanding required forms of personal transformation that were difficult to sustain and impossible to reverse. The man who had learned to see political problems from multiple cultural perspectives simultaneously had acquired abilities that made him valuable as a cultural interpreter but unsuited for the simplified identities that normal social life required. His capacity for shapeshifting between different cultural contexts had been essential for his wartime effectiveness, but it had also created psychological structures that could not be maintained without the external pressures that had originally shaped them. In this sense, Lawrence's personal tragedy was also a kind of cautionary tale about the limits of individual adaptation to cultural complexity. He had pushed the boundaries of cross-cultural understanding further than perhaps anyone before or since, but the price of that understanding had been the loss of any stable sense of personal identity that could provide psychological security in circumstances where such complex navigation was not required. The cottage at Clouds Hill, preserved as a memorial to his memory, stands as a monument to this fundamental contradiction, a retreat that provided solitude for someone who had learned to function most effectively in circumstances that required constant engagement with other people's expectations and needs. The sparse furnishings and carefully chosen books reflect the preferences of someone who had learned to value simplicity, but they also suggest the isolation of someone who could no longer find meaning in the ordinary relationships that sustained most people's lives. Lawrence's literary legacy, embodied primarily in 7 pillars of wisdom but extending through his correspondence and translations, represents one of the most honest attempts ever made to describe the psychological reality of cross-cultural military and political collaboration. His combination of tactical analysis, anthropological observation, and personal confession created a form of memoir that acknowledged both the achievements and the costs of the cultural synthesis he had learned to perform. But even his literary work was shaped by the same contradictions that had defined his life, as his attempts at honest self-examination were inevitably interpreted through the lens of the romantic legend that his achievements had created. Readers who praised the literary merits of his writing were often responding to the very public identity that he had been trying to escape, while those who criticized his account as self-serving missed the genuine self-awareness that had made his analysis possible. The enduring fascination with Lawrence of Arabia, which has produced countless biographies, films, and scholarly studies in the decades since his death, reflects something more than simple interest in romantic adventure or military history. His story continues to resonate because it dramatizes fundamental questions about the possibility of understanding across cultural differences, about the relationship between individual achievement and historical circumstance, about the psychological costs of the kind of flexibility that increasingly complex global relationships seem to require. In an age when cultural diversity and international cooperation have become both more necessary and more difficult to achieve, Lawrence's experience offers insights that extend far beyond the specific circumstances of early 20th century Middle Eastern politics. His demonstration that genuine cross-cultural understanding is possible but comes at significant personal cost remains relevant for anyone attempting to navigate differences in worldview and social organization that seem to be growing more complex rather than less. The man who died in that Dorset hospital in 1935 had lived through the transformation of cultural contact from occasional adventure to daily necessity, from the privilege of a few explorers and scholars to the requirement of anyone seeking to function effectively in an increasingly interconnected world. His success and failure in managing that transformation continue to provide both inspiration and warning for those who must learn to function across cultural boundaries that show no signs of becoming less significant. Let your breathing slow now, as we return from the desert winds and ancient cities to this quiet place where you rest. The story of Lawrence fades like heat shimmer over sand, but something of his struggle remains with us, the recognition that understanding others deeply changes us in ways we cannot predict or control. Feel the weight of your body settling deeper into comfort, like a traveler finally reaching shelter after a long journey across difficult terrain. Lawrence's contradictions need not become yours. His search for identity between worlds can rest now in the telling, no longer a burden to be carried but a story to be remembered. The cottage at Clouds Hill stands empty in the Dorset Hills, its windows reflecting starlight as they have for decades since he last turned the key in its door. The desert camps where he learned Arabic poetry have long since moved on, following water and season as they always have, as they always will. But something remains in the spaces between cultures, in the possibility of seeing the world through another's eyes. Let the complexities of his life dissolve into the simplicity of this moment, breath entering and leaving your body, heartbeat steady as the rhythm of camel bells across endless sand. You need not solve the contradictions that tormented him, they are part of a story now, complete in its incompleteness, at peace in its restlessness. As sleep approaches like the cool desert night, carrying you toward dreams that may echo with the sound of distant places, remember that every life is a journey between worlds, between the person we were and the person we become, between the places we call home and the landscapes that call to us. Lawrence's journey was longer than most, his transformation more complete, his contradictions more visible. But the fundamental human need to bridge differences, to understand and be understood, lives in all of us. Rest now in the knowledge that stories like his continue because they speak to something essential in human nature, the courage to venture into unfamiliar territory, the wisdom to learn from those we encounter there, and the hope that understanding might eventually lead to peace. Let the legend and the man both find their rest as you find yours, in the quiet space where all stories end and sleep begins. Sweet dreams await you now, gentle as sunrise over empty desert, peaceful as still water in a hidden oasis. If you're still awake, that's okay. Just close your eyes and let the story carry you. Subscribe to History for Sleep for a new story every week. Sweet dreams.